To another Sacred Cow BBQ, everyone. It is March 31st. Where is this month gone? It's raced by for me, but I don't think it's gone that quickly for our political prisoners. But I hope it has, but I'm sure those days drag on pretty well. I'm your host, Patricia Aiken, an average host with exceptional guests. And a new guest is going to be joining me later on. His name is Lazaro Esanaro. I hope I'm not brutalizing his name. Yeah, Esanaro, that's right. And he's going to be sharing his research that he's put together, 5,000 pages, about the utter corruption and criminality going on in Oregon around the Hammonds and the Bundys and this whole mess. And so stay tuned for that later on. First, I'm going to just share some tips that I came up with earlier this week. I'm not sure which of them is the most disgusting, so I'm just going to share them in the order I put them here. John Stadmiller interviewed Victoria Sharp just 72 hours after the shooting, and he stated during his show that he had proof from military experts that the video the feds had come from a spy plane half a mile up, not a drone. John said he was told that the original video was so vivid that it took major software attempts to make it look as bad as it did. Not surprising. And probably this is a real stomach turner here. Brianna Bundy shared this with me. I questioned her. And because this week on Monday, Arden Bundy turned 18. And I want to send a happy birthday greeting to Arden and share some love and support for him and everything he's doing, trying to keep things together at the ranch. He's taken off from school. This is his graduation year. And he's not going to school. He's there ranching right now to keep things together. So she texted me back when I said, are they really trying to pick up Arden? And she said, one of the marshals that is taking care of our guys warned us. He said they are fully aware that your youngest boy turns 18 on Monday. Please keep him safe. They want him too, and I don't want to see him in here. Well, what was Arden Bundy's heinous crime during the standoff when he was 16 years old? Well, he carried the American flag. That was his crime. And that's why they want to pick him up. They are looking for an excuse. I mean, if that wouldn't drive this country crazy, I don't know what would. Imagine your 18-year-old son going to prison. Just imagine that for a minute. And then one that I thought was pretty amazing is a video about an supposed FBI agent that someone put up, and it's actually being supported by the Arnold law firm, the lawyers, Mike Arnold's, Hammond Bundy's lawyer. And they put this out because they're looking for other witnesses. And someone took screenshots of this at the time. I mean, it's really kind of interesting on Facebook, and now it's disappeared off Facebook. And you know, if the Department of Justice wanted that page, they could have it in a heartbeat from Mr. Zuckerberg. But I don't think the Arnold Law Group is going to get much traction on trying to get this footage from them, these pages that they show. It's kind of interesting. The guy goes by the name of Jason Mendez. Jason with two N's, like baboon, you know. And he says, let's get this over. Nothing more irritating than insecure hillbillies with weapons who failed American history and married all the wrong heavy people. Jesus. Jerry Springer candidates here. Nice. Yeah, pretty nice. That was posted on his Facebook page. You can see it on that video. And then he goes on to say, on January 26th, the day that lives on in infamy, he posts, "It's over. We're safe," with exclamation marks. Oh, they were so at risk, were they? That's my editorializing. Then he goes on and says, "So now going to take the team home for steaks and beer. Guess I'll file this photo op with this idiot." Now, this is photo op of him shaking hands with Hammond Bundy. He's in full SWAT gear, and he's shaking Hammond's hand. You may remember it. So I'll go back and says, guess I'll file this photo op with this idiot who got his brother also shot and filed under too long and too PC for the Times. Proud of my guys and young lady. Proud, he says. He's showing himself shaking hands with Hammond. It's just disgusting. And then his next complaint here is, this is turning into another media circus. They made the first, and now he's a martyr. BS. We say freeze for a GD reason. So now he's admit that he was at the ambush. And on the page you can see that Malheur National Forest and John Day Highway. He put himself there. So on that day. So that's pretty interesting. And then he says, this guy can't spell, has terrible spelling, horrible grammar, but yet Hammond is the Yahoo here. These Yahoos are too funny. Surveillance in this weather sucks, poor baby. Too funny when we can them looking for us. I don't know, see, he can't type. Too funny when we can probably see them looking for us in the tree line as we're watching them. If they only knew. Then he says, laughing my ass off. They're not as good as they or anyone thinks. Hell, walked up on them many times while they're asleep. Can we go home? Says, laughing my ass off. Idiot hillbillies is how he ends another one of his posts. And so this is what the law firm is coming back with. Jason Mendez, purportedly a member of the hostage rescue team, documented his actions at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and ridiculed the protesters during the month of January. We're looking into whether this page is authentic. Yeah, well, they're not going to get any support from Facebook. Anybody want to bet me? I got 25 cents that says Zuckerberg ain't helping them. I don't care how many warrants they get. They're going to, I don't care. Please do not contact this person. Please let us know if you can verify the authenticity of this page and these posts, or if you know anyone who was a witness to his statements about the Lavoie shooting. Then they go on and on, I mean, he's a veteran, so be respectful. Be respectful. This notice is part of Arnold Law and Hammond's crowdsourcing campaign to encourage the public and whistleblowers to come forward and tell the truth. It goes on and it's signed, thank you, Mike Arnold, attorney for Hammond Bundy. Well, which one of those did you think was the most disgusting? I don't know. They're all pretty darn bad. They're all pretty bad. So listen, what I want to share with you folks is about murder on the Supreme Court and what it led to. Now, I know when I say murder of a Supreme Court justice, you're all going to think Judge Scalia, and rightly so. But I want to say this isn't a new tactic. This has happened before when they wanted to pass some big legislation that was destructive to America. So I would say, as I'm reading this, it's called Murder on the Supreme Court by Eustace Mullins, who was he was right about so many things. I mean, he had a couple things off, but man, I mean, what that man went through to tell the truth. He was fired from every job he was ever in, threatened by the FBI. They did, tried to murder him. When he was an elderly man by surrounding him. Just incredible things that he went through to tell the truth about what was going on in America. So I'm going to share with you this story, and you might think that integration of schools was a good thing. But I just want you to think back before I read this and say to yourself, are the schools better today than they were in 1954? The answer would be no. I mean, look at the McGuffey Reader. The McGuffey Reader was unbelievable. I mean, there are fifth graders that probably couldn't read the first grade McGuffey Reader today. And so this was the dumbing down and part of the destruction of America. It has been just a full-blown assault on every area of our lives. So here we have Murder on the Supreme Court by Eustace Mullins. I don't have the date when this was written, but I think it was in the 90s. America's public schools have been corrupted. A generation of white American children has been destroyed, resulting in an inarticulate, functionally illiterate, mumbling youth who is probably on drugs and who is incapable of caring about what is happening to himself or to his nation. In these blackboard jungles, Teachers are warned not to wear any jewelry or to carry any funds except lunch money, and never go into the hall or to the restroom alone. This chaos was deliberately created by the Supreme Court decision of May 17, 1954, in favor of Brown versus Board of Education, which ordered federal forced racial integration of every school in the United States. This decision not only has cost the American taxpayer more than $100 billion in added education costs, but the social and economic chaos resulting from this decision has cast the American Republic down from its position of unchallenged world hegemony, which it held in 1954, and in which it has been replaced by the Soviet Union. This, as we shall see, was no accident. Since the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, Americans have been deluged with official exhortations to obey the rule of law, exhortations which have no reference to the increasing crime rate, but are addressed solely to efforts by Americans to preserve their schools. Yet no writer has ever made a complete study of the legal background of Brown versus Board of Education, excepting a 2-volume study, Simple Justice, by Richard Kluger and published by Knopf in 1975, which rapturously extols the decisions as a milestone of human progress, in which unintentionally reveals that the legal arguments leading to this decision are so ludicrous that the lawyer for the Board of Education, John W. Davis, dismissed it as guff. It was not the power of the legal arguments which led to the favorable decision on Brown versus Board of Education, but a more direct and compelling force, the murder of Chief Justice Fred Vinson. While I'm reading this, I want you to think about what they're trying to accomplish with the murder of Antonin Scalia. This decision was a complete reversal of the position of the Supreme Court precedent on segregated schools, which has stood for more than 50 years. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, which established the separate but equal doctrine of public education. This Plessy versus Ferguson decision stated, "The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Laws permitting and even requiring their separation in places where they are liable to be brought into contact do not necessarily imply the inferiority of either race to the other, or have been generally, if not universally, recognized as within the competency of the state legislatures in the exercise of their political power. The most common instance of this is connected with the establishment of separate schools for white and colored children, which has been held to be a valid exercise of the legislative power, even by courts of states where the political rights of the colored race have been longest and most earnestly enforced. Thus, Plessy versus Ferguson specifically stated that the courts could not enforce social as distinguished from political equality and upheld the legality of segregated schools. Yet Brown versus Board of Education deliberately overturned this precedent and committed the federal government to enforce by every means of its police powers social equality in integrated schools. Very few people in Washington had any idea that such a decision could be reached, especially when the Supreme Court began hearings on Brown versus Board of Education on December 13, 1952. The Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, was the epitome of the old-time Southern politician. Born in a plantation home in Kentucky, Fred Vinson had been one of the key congressmen who aided Franklin Delano Roosevelt in guiding his New Deal measures through Congress. He played a vital role in the subversion which involved the United States in the war to save Soviet Russia, and as a reward, Truman had appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. When Truman telephoned him the glad tidings, Vinson, one of the genuine humorists in Washington, quipped, "Thank you, Harry. I always wanted the chance to study law." The joke was more than apropos, for the new chief jurist of the nation, a lifelong politician, had never practiced law. He remained a pillar of the Washington political establishment, and in 1951, Harry Truman had repeatedly urged him to announce his candidacy to succeed Truman as president. However, Vincent was very comfortable in his job, as the Supreme Court at that time had a leisurely procession of cases, and he looked forward to another 20 years of his placid life. Certainly, he had no idea that his stance on Brown versus Board of Education would lead to his murder. When the Supreme Court opened its hearings on Brown versus Board of Education in 1952, no one expected any surprises. It was merely another in a series of cases which the NAACP had been bringing to the court in its unrelenting but futile efforts to destroy segregated schools, that is, schools which, unlike the integrated schools of New York City, where education had come to a halt because of racial turmoil, actually educated children. However, the justices were surprised by the massive force of this effort. More than 200 people had been hired by the NAACP at a cost of $10,000 a day to prepare material for this case. That was a lot of money in 1952. Which presented the demand of a Topeka child, Brown, to attend a white school in that city. To this day, no one has ever inquired where the NAACP obtained the vast sums of money it expended in this fight, but a number of organizations which presented briefs in support of the NAACP probably advanced the money, all of it tax-exempt funds. These organizations included the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, the CIO Political Action Committee, the American Jewish Committee, AMVETS, the American Civil Liberties Union, or as I say, the American Criminal Liberties Union, and other groups which spent millions of dollars to promote communist subversion in America. The most reliable estimate is that the NAACP spent $10 million on Brown versus Board of Education, yet its entire presentation was false because it came from the Supreme Court under the name of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, when in fact it was not a Negro organization at all, but a Jewish-dominated and sponsored group whose president was a Jew, Joel Springard, and whose entire budget was donated by the Jews. The lawyer for the NAACP, a Negro named Thurgood Marshall, was actually a front for the legal brain of the NAACP, the Jew Jack Greenberg. In Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court was swamped by masses of verbose and largely irrelevant material presented by the NAACP staff of 200 lawyers and researchers. This case, which had been thought to reserve about 2 weeks of the court's time, dragged on for several months until it was apparent it could not be completed during the current 1952-53 term. It was obvious that the NAACP was deliberately stalling for time, but the purpose of this stall was not then known. We know now that delays were intended solely to allow for the elimination of Supreme Court Justice Fred Vinson from the case. The lawyer for the Board of Education was none other than the most distinguished lawyer in America, John W. Davis, former presidential candidate and senior partner of Davis, Polk & Wardell of New York, the most important single corporate law firm in the United States. Davis, like Vinson, was a dignified, white-haired Southern gentleman born in West Virginia who earned $1 million a year from his law practice. There was no question that there was considerable personal rapport between him and the Chief Justice, as contrasted to the ratty and furtive machinations of the lawyers from the NAACP. However, Davis was confident of winning the case on its merits. His vast knowledge of constitutional law convinced him, as the hearings progressed, that the NAACP had no evidence which would influence the court in its favor. After a preliminary examination of this material, Davis wrote to his associate in the case, Robert Figg, "I have never read a drearier lot of testimony than that furnished by so-called educational and psychological experts." On September 29, 1952, Davis had written to Figg, I have read the brief and appendix submitted by your opponents, and there seems to be nothing in them which requires special comment. I think it's perfectly clear from interior evidence that the witness Clark drafted the appendix, which is signed by the worthy social scientist. I can only say that if that sort of guff can move any court, God save the state. The testimony presented by the NAACP ranged from the trivial to the ludicrous. The principal witness was a, quote, psychologist named Kenneth Clark. His teacher at Columbia University had been Dr. Henry Garrett, the most famous psychologist in America. Garrett stated that Clark had been none too bright as a student, but would rank pretty high for a Negro. Now, Clark told the Supreme Court about his famous doll test. He had been showing both black and white dolls to some Negro children, and they picked the white dolls in preference to the black. When he asked them why, they said that white dolls were superior. From these tests, quote, Clark deduced that the Negro children were suffering an inferiority complex because they could not go to school with white children. Incredibly enough, this nonsense comprised the bulk of the testimony on which the case was finally decided. However, at the time, little comment was made on it because the justices were following the lead of Chief Justice Fred Vinson, who was obviously unmoved by such frippery. The court had a number of oblique methods of making its forthcoming position known on cases under discussion, such as notes to other justices. Justice Jackson later stated that the Chief Justice had made a note in 1953 during the hearings of Brown versus Board of Education. Face complete abolition of public schools in the South. Serious. Vinson referred to the probability that if a favorable ruling on Brown was issued by the court, the southern states would probably close their schools rather than integrate under federal control. Justice Reed told one of his 1953 term clerks, John D. Fassett, that he expected Vinson to vote to uphold segregation. In the Solicitor General's office, a radical civil rights attorney, Fred Ellman, stated that he heard that the Chief Justice did not favor overruling Plessy versus Ferguson. At the conclusion of the 1952-53 term, there was a general understanding about those in the know in Washington that after brief hearings at the beginning of the 1953-54 term to accommodate the masses of junk filed by the NAACP and its sewer associates, the ADL, etc., Vinson would issue his ruling against Brown versus Board of Education. John W. Davis, who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms and whose profession involved anticipating judicial rulings, stated he expected a 6-3 favorable ruling. Although he did not say so, he obviously knew that the three most radical justices, Frankfurter, Douglas, and Black, would favor Brown and that the other five would follow Vinson's lead. Davis gave his summation to Justice Moore, later president of BEPCO Power in Virginia. Vinson further showed his position that he refused to allow the National Lawyers Guild, a notorious communist front, to file a brief with the court in favor of Brown. Meanwhile, the radical lawyers in the Department of Justice had worked for weeks on a fire-eating statement in favor of Brown and the NAACP, which they persuaded Attorney General McGranary bring before the Supreme Court. The clerk of the court, Harold B. Wiley, sent McGranary packing, ordering him out by saying, "The Chief Justice does not want any political speeches by you in this court." On June 8, 1953, all five of the segregation cases before the court were restored to the docket for October 12, 1953, re-argument. It was commonly believed this would be a brief formality and that a decision would be reached. However, at 11:15 a.m. on September 8, 1953, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died of a, quote, heart attack at his Washington hotel. Only 63 years old and in vigorous health, Vinson had no previous health problems. A robust man who enjoyed life, he gave no indication of heart problems. The news was extremely shocking to everyone who knew him at the time. No foul play was suspected, even though it was known that there were 18 poisons currently being used by intelligence agencies, which would cause a perfect medical case of heart attack. Despite the fact that he died only a few days before the court was to resume hearings on Brown versus Board of Education, there was no conjecture in Washington that this would seriously affect the anticipating ruling against the court against Brown. It was anticipated that President Eisenhower would name a conservative jurist to the court and that John W. Davis's forecast of the 6-3 ruling would hold. Some might have suspected otherwise when Felix Frankfurter gleefully chortled on hearing of his colleague's death, "This is the first indication I have ever had that there is a God." This joyful exclamation should have been a tip-off that Vincent's death would indeed change the expected rulings on Brown, because Frankfurter made this statement to his law clerk in reference to the forthcoming hearings on this case. Despite his august position as a justice of the Supreme Court, Frankfurter held the shadiest background of anyone ever appointed to the court. A Viennese Jew, he entered the United States by unknown means and immediately involved himself in a terrorist underground activities using Harvard University as his base of operations. President Theodore Roosevelt denounced him as the most dangerous radical in America. No one has ever disproved this statement. Having obtained a position as professor at Harvard Law School, Frankfurter unleashed a horde of Alger hisses upon his unsuspecting America. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president as a result of a violent anti-Hoover campaign by the Communist Party, Frankfurter was one of the first to be summoned to Washington to form what was to be a government of revolutionaries. Frankfurter was able to insinuate his protégés from Harvard Law School into policy-making positions in every government department. Many of them are still there today, a succession of presidents having been unable or unwilling to replace him. It was finally revealed after his death that Frankfurter had been the secret mastermind of the Harold Ware cell of communists, which has in effect ruled the United States since 1933. His sordid background was further revealed when Westbrook Pegler finally printed a story which had been common knowledge at the National Press Club for years, that while Frankfurter was serving on the Supreme Court, his brother Otto was serving a long sentence at Anamosa State Prison in Iowa. I was told this by the president of the National Press Club in 1950, who, being from Anamosa, had found out the story while on a vacation visit to his hometown. Yet it was 2 years before Pegler printed this story. The other justice in favor of Brown, William Douglas, was already showing signs of mental strain due to his passion for young girls, which finally brought him to a wheelchair. Congressman Gerald Ford, in the only positive action he undertook during many years in Congress, finally moved for Douglas's impeachment as morally unfit, not only because of his pursuit of young girls, but because of his deep financial involvement with a mafia holding company, Parvin Dorman Company. Despite the open and shut nature of the case, Gerald Ford, with his usually bumbling incompetence, did little with the case, which has been bottled up by one of the most corrupt men on Capitol Hill, Congressman Manny Seller of the House Judiciary Committee. Seller was a New York Jew who became a multi-millionaire by representing corporations and voting on legislation which benefited them, yet he was never arrested. The Douglas impeachment bill was finally shelved, and Ford returned to his usual do-nothing status until the Watergate imbroglio brought him to the White House. While Washington waited to see which conservative jurist President Eisenhower would name to dispose of Brown versus Board of Education, Eisenhower made a selection which proved Robert Welch's assertion that Eisenhower was under Communist Party discipline. He chose Earl Warren of California, and he chose him solely on the basis that Warren would vote in favor of Brown. Warren owed his own political eminence to one of the most brutal episodes in American history. While serving as Attorney General of California, Warren seized upon Pearl Harbor as an excuse to place Japanese Americans in concentration camps for the duration of the war and to seize all their property. Warren had no judicial experience whatsoever, but did study law at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York under the infamous Rabbi Finkelstein. In February 1942, Warren addressed a conference of district attorneys as follows. It is strange that there has yet been no reports of sabotage in California, but this means they are waiting to strike everywhere at once. He rushed to Washington to testify before a special House committee that the Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom held American citizenship, were poised to launch a nationwide campaign of sabotage and terrorism. The congressman immediately supported the measures to intern the Japanese Americans. To this day, there has never been a recorded instance of Japanese sabotage in the United States during World War II. Warren was well aware that there was no danger of Japanese sabotage, but he was also aware, as California Attorney General, of the extent of the holdings of Japanese Americans in California. Miles of Imperial Valley ranch land, downtown buildings, and businesses had been built up by the thrifty, hard-working Japanese. With the Japanese imprisoned in concentration camps, Warren seized all of their properties and awarded them to his henchmen. Some of them bought 1,000-acre farms for $100. Others simply wrote themselves deeds to the now vacant properties. They became known as the Committee of 100 because 100 of them became multi-millionaires as the result of Warren's takeover. Today, they are the wealthiest families in California, as the seized properties, which even in 1942 were worth millions, are now worth in the tens of millions. A few of the Japanese, after lengthy court battles 30 years later, have won awards of $5,000 or $6,000 for their stolen property. With the unlimited financial backing of his Committee of 100, Warren swamped all appointments to become governor of California. He then launched a presidential campaign, but despite the millions at his disposal, he could not overcome the national distaste at his unsavory role as the persecutor of the Japanese. He went to the Chicago Convention in 1952 with a solid block of California delegates, ostensibly supporting Taft, but at the crucial moment he switched to Eisenhower. Now the debt was to be paid by his selection as Chief Justice, a nomination at which even Eisenhower blanched. On October 5, 1953, Eisenhower announced he had chosen Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It was immediately noted that Warren was most deferential to Felix Frankfurter on the court, and Washington observers surmised that Warren, new to Washington, had placed himself in Frankfurter's hands. Arguments on Brown versus Board of Education were resumed, but as months dragged on, the case seemed to be in limbo. Washington journalists no longer speculated on it, expecting that some afternoon a brief announcement would be made that the case had been ruled out. May 17, 1954, seemed to be an uneventful day at the Supreme Court. Opinions were read on several cases of no great public interest, but at 12:52 p.m., observers were stunned when Chief Justice Warren began reading the opinion. Oliver Brown and others versus Board of Education of Topeka. After noting that all of the evidence presented by the NAACP was inconclusive, Warren then stated in a unanimous decision of the court, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment." Warren further stated, in view of our decision that the Constitution prohibits the states from maintaining racially segregated public schools, it would be unthinkable that the same Constitution would impose a lesser duty on the federal government. These words committed the federal government to use all of its police powers to force integrated public schools on a nationwide basis. $100 billion later, the public education had come to a virtual standstill. Thousands of white children have been maimed or killed, and the public schools have become dope distribution centers where muggings and rapes are daily occurrences. It was to forestall this horrible event that this writer wrote for Women's Voice an article in 1955, "Close the Public Schools." This article is even more valid today than it was written when it was written 30 years ago. The public schools force involuntary servitude and physical bondage upon children removing them from the protection of their homes and parents, and placing them in situations in which battle-hardened Marines would be hard put to defend themselves. To state that it is necessary to improve the children by, quote, educating them in these brutal conditions is to mock the meaning of the word. Thousands of white parents have seen their children become hopeless drug addicts while attending public schools, their only way out in inevitable suicide. This is the tangible result of Earl Warren's decision on Brown versus Board of Education. But how did he arrive at this decision, and how was it that the decision previously seen by John W. Davis, the most accomplished lawyer in America, as 6-3 against Brown, had suddenly become unanimous in favor of Brown, on evidence which Warren admitted was inconclusive? The answer lay in the justice's knowledge that Fred Vinson had died because of his opposition to Brown, and that tremendous pressure would now be brought against anyone who did not go along with the new Warren Frankfurter court. Thus it was in fear of their lives that the other justices who had previously supported Vinson now voted unanimously with Frankfurter. Did they know that Frankfurter was the secret mastermind of the Harold Wersell of communists? Probably not. But how could they accept the contention that the NAACP, that certain Negro children not identified had suffered psychological damage because they had not attended white schools? Kenneth Clark could easily have interviewed Negro children who attended integrated schools in northern cities in order to ascertain if they had psychological differences from Negro children who had been educated in segregated schools, but he never did this. For several years, there has been a growing suspicion in Washington that Fred Vinson's too timely heart attack had in fact been a case of murder. One thing, his family reported that nowhere in his court papers could they find a single reference to Brown versus Board of Education, yet he had spent months listening to arguments on this case and must have made voluminous notes toward an opinion. To this day, not a single note has been found. Because of the evidence presented had no basis in fact, apologists for the Supreme Court later claimed that the justices had relied heavily on the massive, quote, scholarly study of racial problems in America by a radical Swedish sociologist, Gunnar Myrdal. This book, An American Dilemma, had been subsidized by the Rockefellers and given wide distribution in their pro-communist schools of sociology. In fact, it was later learned that not a single justice had ever read An American Dilemma. This lie has been disseminated to the press to give the incredible decision a hint of, quote, intellectual background. Who actually murdered Fred Vinson? That is something that will probably never be known for sure, but there can be little doubt that the same mostly Jewish forces that backed the NAACP case were involved in the planning. And since Vinson's heart attack in 1953, not a single federal judge has dared issue a decision against forced integration of the schools. The only way to eventually reverse Brown versus Board of Education is for Christians to retake America from the Jews. Well, you're listening to that and you're seeing it in the 1953 context, but I would urge you to see it in the context of what's they're pushing before the Supreme Court now. And that can be summed up in two words, gun grab. They are desperate to fully take over the United States, and to do that, they have got to take your guns away. And that, to me, is why Justice Scalia was murdered, to be able to change the makeup of the Supreme Court, put someone on, and they've sent a huge message, just like the message they sent by the murder of Federal Judge John Roll, who was the constitutional attorney that was killed in the so-called Gabby Gifford shooting. That sent a message. Don't go getting all constitutional on us, gentlemen and ladies. We won't stand for it. So that's what I think. So there you have it. So that's Eustace Mullins. I'm telling you, he has written some amazing books. If you want to see how interconnected everything is, I recommend that you read Murder by Injection. Anyone that's concerned about, and you can find these copies all online. They're all over. Just look up Eustace Mullins. there's been some fabulous videos of him that I didn't know existed either. I didn't understand what a tremendous law researcher he was, and how he was always a pro se litigant, or he changed his status to something, I forget what he called it. But he actually won millions of dollars against, I think it was the FBI. He didn't never want to collect it. He just kept renewing it all the time, just as a reminder to them. Not that it helped, because they were always after him. So that's what I think's going on here. So we've got a few minutes before the break at the top of the hour. Let me see what's going on here. Rico is asking me for something. Yeah. So here's something else that I wanted to bring up, and this goes along with court things as well. Someone, a good researcher, brought up what he calls reverse jury nullification. Now, we most of us know what jury nullification is, but we don't know what reverse jury nullification is. This, at least I didn't. Most of us have never heard of it. And and this is what happens when a jury is not allowed to have enough information to make an informed decision. Now, that would surely apply to the Hammonds, where the jurors were never allowed to hear the purpose of backfires or fires to improve the range by burning off the old inedible grasses, adding carbon to the soil, bringing up new grasses to feed the wildlife and the cattle. So I think that's pretty interesting. That's something that we need to look into here, reverse jury nullification. But my guest at the top of the hour, I'm going to try and see if I can dial him in a little bit early and see. Let me see if we got going on this. So a lot of things going on. I again want to quote this Gary Lawson. He observes the modern administrative state is not merely unconstitutional, it is anti-constitutional. The Constitution was designed specifically to prevent the emergence of the kinds of institutions that characterize the modern administrative state. Wow. That pretty much says it all. And you have to be wondering, Cliven Bundy, a flight risk and danger to the community. Really? I mean, they haven't been able to get him to budge off his ranch. I mean, they've offered him all kinds of money to buy him out and things, and no, he said no all the time. The only place Cliven Bundy would go would be home to Bundy Ranch. And a danger to the community. Yeah, he might start talking about the Constitution. And I want to have our own, one of our other hosts here, Ivy West, on to talk about the difference between the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution for the United States. I heard her give a great run on that a week or so ago, and I'm still trying to get a hold of her to have her on sometime. So, and Multnomah County, Hammond Bundy, I might be able to play you that. It's just, his pleading with people to keep praying for them, and that God is supporting them in this, as difficult as it is. It's really difficult. I mean, they're husbands and fathers. I mean, they're not criminals. They miss being home with their wives, having their kids climb all over them. I mean, it's been very, very hard. So it'd be interesting to see if Pete Santilli and Joe O'Shaughnessy are going to be able to, if the judge is going to sign their subpoena concerning the order for certain private records of particular government agents. She has decided to put that signing on hold, and that was something from last week. So I think this is all pretty interesting, and so let's. I've got to say that you're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. We are listener and volunteer supported. And so I want to encourage you, if you're a regular listener, to run over, make a donation, freedomslips.com, buy something. There's all kinds of cool stuff there. You can get the archives, listen to whatever you want, whenever you want. I mean, there's all kinds of great stuff here. So support the station, and we wouldn't have to make these kinds of announcements. And if you missed this last week, I want to just share this with you now. I've said all along that it was not only FBI, it was not only Oregon State Police, but there had to be some kind of IMF forces there. Well, the UN forces are the IMF's forces. And this is what an agent said in a deposition. I knew going into that there was a sheriff in Grant County that was supporting the movement or the ideology behind what they were pushing. I knew that there was a large amount of community members in Grant County that supported their beliefs and that had similar constitutional beliefs, and to the point of the Grant County making it clear that they are a UN free zone. And so that knowledge was known to all of us. So that's why they had to murder Lavoy Finicum on the highway before they got to Grant County. And that's where they are on. But you know, Oregon Live, man, is that paper like appetite suppressant or what? I mean, it's absolutely amazing how bad that report is. So, and I'll give you a couple of other highlights here on the week. Let's see. Oh, now this is how you become a refugee, okay? And this is from and I want to thank Stu for sending this. Refugee slits family throats, then flees to Europe. The most distressing account of a counselor working with the UN in Turkey was, the Express said, when she discovered an entire family who had been murdered in cold blood by a refugee who then fled to Europe. According to the report, the worker came across the house full of people, children included, with their throats slit. She said the killer was a Syrian refugee who took everything before heading west. Her work in Turkey was founded on a government initiative to rehome refugees away from the camps into Turkish homes, where they were given guaranteed work and a chance of a new life. But she said around a third of those given the opportunity to live and work in Turkish towns and cities ultimately fled to Europe, lured by the promise of Western lifestyles. Yeah, I mean, that's just crazy. That's just crazy. And I'm going to bring up, and I want to thank Drew for this. Let me find it. It's going to be right, here, coming up. And this was some research that Drew Carter did. And I want to thank him for this because I really think it turns the tables on this refugee situation. And he says, I think we should take as many refugees as Israel does. And I agree with that. And he said, I made this statement to a friend. They surmised because it was probably because Israel is so small. I didn't have a comeback for that, so I did some research. Well, Belgium is 11,000 square miles and has 14,000 refugees. Switzerland is 15,000 square miles and it has 12,000 refugees. Sweden, again 15,000 square miles, has 106,000 refugees. Poor Sweden. Oh. Macedonia, which is 9,000 square miles, approximately the same size as Israel, has 400,000 refugees. Lebanon, half the size of Israel, at 4,000 square miles, has 1.5 million, 1.5 million refugees in an area half the size of Israel. In Israel, at 8.8 thousand square miles, anybody want to hazard a guess? The person that comes the closest without going over wins a door prize. Okay, that would be 0 refugees. 0. So if you don't think this is Greater Israel's attack on the West, think again, because it is clearly that. Clearly that. So let's tap. I think we should do some tapping for our friend Arden Bundy. And I'm going to find the tapping, and I think we can get it done here in the next minute. Okay, I had to close all this down because Skype was acting up. Here we go. Let's just say, why don't you, if you know how to do this, you just fold your arms across your chest, and then you tap on one side for 3 to 10 times, and then on the other side. And I think we should say that there's a part of each of us that knows how to send Arden Bundy full, unencumbered freedom and justice in all aspects of life in safety and security. And this part of us is doing so now with unlimited love, grace, and ease. His mind, body, and spirit are receiving the love and healing, security, freedom, information and permission, and relief now. Let's all take a deep breath and feel Arden's secure feeling. Information transfer is now complete, so be it, it is done. And then we grab each wrist and say peace and peace. So stay with us, everybody. We're going to be back with Lazaro Encenaro, and he is going to be sharing the highlights of 5,000 pages of documents that he has researched showing the abject criminality in Oregon. It'll be, we're just going to be able to hit the highlights, and he's planning very quickly on producing a YouTube video that shows you the pages that he's talking about. And that should be really a fascinating time. So stay tuned. We'll be back with Lazaro.